So we'll go ahead and get started. So thank you all for joining this week's Web Tips presented by myself, Ken Engel. Just a little introduction on the Web Tips. Everybody's muted, but you are able to access a questions box in the dashboard there. So if you have any questions, please type them out, and I'll do my best to answer them as soon as I can. A little bit about myself. I've been with the company for about 3 years, and prior to that, after graduating from college in 2014, I've been working on game development, actually, and UX design, user experience, and UI design, and I'm also a certified Scrum Master, so kind of, dove myself into the software world immediately after college. And I've been developing with Winshuttle for about 2.5 years now. This web tip session is going to be about workflow and plugins. So a few examples that I wrote down here of pretty common plugins that you'll see often in workflows would be the copy attachments, delete item, set item permissions, set column, execute Powershell Command, Oledb Query, wait, and Winshuttle update. Now, these are just a few of the plugins. There's a reference guide on Winshuttle's website if you'd like to review all of them, or you could just open up Composer and add a plugin to the workflow and see what they are, but there's quite a bit of options. These are just some of the ones that I see very often when we're developing workflows. So I kind of divided them up into categories. Of those 8 plugins, there are 3 of what I would consider SharePoint plugins that interface with SharePoint. So there's the delete item plugin, which kind of explains itself. It deletes a SharePoint item. So you can provide a SharePoint site and list of where you'd like to delete the item, and then you can provide parameters for which item you'd like to delete. So most commonly we'll add a SharePoint ID into there, because that's the most direct way of accessing a SharePoint item. But there is an option to provide a camel query, which will allow you to base your search for an item off of a lot more than just a list item. So really any other column that's in the list, you can base that off of. There's the set item permissions plugin, which sets a user's permissions to a SharePoint item. So you provide it a username or a SharePoint group name. So you can provide permissions to an entire group or just one single user. And then you would provide a permission type such as read access or contribute access or full access, and they'd be granted that access to that item. There's the set column plugin, which is a pretty cool plugin because it allows you to run specific functions in the workflow. So if you're familiar with working in Composer, there are quite a few options in terms of running logic. You can create rule wizard rules to run logic in the form, or you can create your own custom JavaScript rules. But there aren't nearly as many options in terms of running logic in the workflow, since it's all running on the server rather than running in your browser. But one way you can run some logic in the workflow is through the set column plugin. So you can run mathematical calculations. If you need to calculate something on the fly outside of the form in the workflow, you can do that using the set column plugin. You can run a couple common functions that I listed below there. So there's a link directly to the website which tells you all of the functions that you're able to run. But these were just a couple of the ones that I see commonly. The date function will allow you to grab whatever today's date is, or there's an optional parameter you can plug in there which will give you the date an X number of days out from today's date. So if you put in a 1, it'll give you tomorrow's date, for example. There's the format function, which will you can format a date into a different format if you like day, month, year, year, or something of the like. There's the regular expression extract, which is reg exp extract, which is really cool because it allows you to run regular expression and extract, a certain string from an existing field in the form. And that is one of the examples that I set up in the demo that you'll see in a few minutes here. So you can actually, run regular expression, say if you have a dollar field that has a dollar amount in it, but you're trying to get it into SQL, and the SQL column is set as a number field, so you just need to extract the actual number from the dollar amount. You can run a regular expression to, strip out all the symbols and all that to make sure that it's just a floating number rather than a string with symbols in it. So that's really cool. Moving on, these are some script and database interfacing plugins. So executing a PowerShell command, that's another pretty common one. You can create a PowerShell script on the SharePoint web front end, add a specific file path, and then call that script from the workflow by providing the file path. And then an option for this plugin is to pass in parameters from the form. So, generally if you're trying to reach out to a specific item and make a change to a form that you have in process, you would pass in that form ID or the SharePoint ID so that you can reference that form. Or, sometimes you're making global updates where all the logic is kind of taken care of in the script itself, and you don't necessarily have to go out and grab a specific item from SharePoint. You could just run the script without giving it any parameters. There's the Oledb Query, which allows you to run a query against a SQL database. So you could do anything from inserting, updating, deleting lines from SQL. And an important note that I kind of listed here is it's very helpful to test your SharePoint or your SQL queries in SQL Management Studio if you have the opportunity to, because it's a little bit more difficult to test these queries in the workflow since you have to get to that plugin in the workflow, and then you have to process it and make sure that there aren't any errors. So a common thing that I had to work through when I was first using this plugin is making sure that I tested all of my queries and making sure that they're valid queries and that the syntax is correct before getting them into the workflow, because it's a lot easier to troubleshoot that kind of stuff within SQL Management Studio than it is in the workflow. And then we have the Winshuttle Update plugin, which I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with. It's just simply running a script from a Winshuttle script from the workflow. So a transaction script or a query script, that's what this would be used for. And one of the best practices that we implement in all of our transaction scripts when we're running them in the workflow, and I'll show an example of this once we get to the demo. Every time we run a transaction script in the workflow, we like to add transition lines after that transaction script runs to check the log field for that transaction script and make sure that there weren't any errors. So, if there is an error in a transaction script, we're assuming that, somebody needs to look at it and make sure that the script runs correctly. So we always check to see if there was an error, and if there was an error, assign a task to some sort of group that handles the error. And, they could either send it back to the workflow to reprocess it, or they could just run the script on that form view, whatever the process needs. But we always like to capture those errors and make sure that it's handled. And then a couple miscellaneous plugins that are still pretty commonly used. The copy attachment plugin, which allows you to copy an attachment from a attachment control on the form to a file path in the server. And we don't as commonly see, a direct file path to a drive on a server being used, but we do pretty commonly see network shared drives being used to copy attachments to. So, say you have an archive somewhere that's on a shared network drive, you could just put this plugin in the workflow and it'll copy directly to that drive. And the wait plugin, which is another pretty simple one, it forces the workflow to wait a certain period of time before processing through the rest of the workflow. So where we see this used generally is, if you're within a loop in the workflow that needs to run multiple times. So like, say you're using a Winshuttle query to check for data in SAP to make sure that the data exists there after running a script or something like that. You could use the wait plugin to make sure that the workflow waits, 1 day before checking, so that you check, once per day, and then after a certain amount of days, assign a task if nothing's found. So that's one of the common applications that we'll see for wait plugins. All right, so now into the demo. I've constructed a bit of a solution here to show you some of these plugins. So first I'll kind of step through what these plugins look like. The set column plugin, as I was describing, we're using the regexp extract function here. So you would tell it, which SharePoint column you wish to put the data into, and then within the function you say, this is the column that I want to extract it from, and then this would be your regular expression here. So basically we're just extracting all of the digits from the field, and you'll see that working within the form. And it's good practice to set the form field after you use a set column. So we're doing that here. We're just setting the total price formatted field to the promoted field in SharePoint. Because if you open up the form and the form field hasn't been set to the SharePoint column, and then you submit that through the workflow, this form field will be blank, but the SharePoint column will be populated. And if you submit it through the workflow, that blank form field will then overwrite what you just did in your SharePoint column. So it's important to set the form field equal to the SharePoint column after using the set column plugin. And then we have the copy attachments. We don't really have a network drive that on our server, so I'm just going to a folder that I created on the C drive and referencing our attachments plugin on the form. Run PowerShell. So this is where you would put in your arguments for any of the parameters you wish. So we're just referencing the SharePoint ID so that we can grab a reference to the form that we're going to submit and run this script that I created here. Now this Oledb query is where the configuration gets a little bit more tricky, because there's quite a few things you have to configure here. And the Oledb plugin is actually pretty specific in the way that you have to write out some of these parameters. So this would be your connection string. You would pretty much just tell it which catalog you're looking at. We're looking at the Winshuttle data catalog. Provide a user ID and password, which I've just omitted for security purposes. I have not seen trusted connections in here work. I don't believe that they do. So you will have to you will have to use a specific user ID and password and make sure that that user ID is able to log in using SQL authentication rather than Windows authentication. And then the data source here would be the server that you're connecting to. And then this would be your insert statement. So it's a very standard insert statement that you would see in SQL. The only difference is in the values. You would put question marks here in the values that you wish to be referenced as form fields. So both the total price and the request ID are form fields, but say we had some sort of field that we know is always going to be the same constant value, we can put hard-coded values in here as well. You would just surround them by single quotes and write in the exact data that you would want to put in there rather than a question mark. So question marks mean that you're referencing form fields, but you can still put hard-coded data in there. And then the parameters here, you're just basically relisting out the columns, the SQL column names with @ symbols in front of them separated by commas. And then in the parameter types, you're just telling it what the column type is. So it's important to look at SQL and make sure that you know if it's a string or if it's an integer or something like that. And then here's where it's a little bit more important. When I first was using this plugin, the first few times I struggled with errors in the way that this syntax is, because in certain parameters, like the parameters here, you're able to put spaces in between the commas, but this does not like spaces quite as much. So if you put spaces in between, the form fields that we have here with the comma, this will actually cause an error in the workflow. And it took me kind of a little bit of time to realize that that's where the error was coming from. But you want to make sure that anytime you're using form fields, that there is no white space. You just separate them by columns, no space, commas, no spaces, and it shouldn't cause any errors. Set item permissions, that's pretty straightforward as well. I'm providing a hard-coded username here, but as I said before, you could just provide a group name if you wish, or you can provide a form field that references a username dynamically. And then the permission type here, I'm giving it full control. And then you would just navigate to your SharePoint site, the list you wish to grant permissions to, and then I put in the ID here because I'm granting permissions to whichever instance of the form we're currently launching. Our wait plugin here is going to wait 5 minutes. So you'll see the syntax here is day, period, hours, colon, minutes, colon, seconds. So right here I'm just telling it to wait 5 minutes before we delete the SharePoint item. All right, now I'll launch this form here. Actually, before I process this form, you can see this is all SQL data, and I'll go into SQL to show you what that data looks like. So if we execute the query, you'll see that you see the exact same data in the SQL database as we see on the form. So if I wanted to change one of these items, and add a new item, once this processes through the workflow, we should see the items add successfully. So the PowerShell script that I created for this demo is updating SQL, and the reason that I'm using a PowerShell script to do this rather than the Oledb Query plugin is because this data exists in a repeating table. So if you were to try to use the Oledb plugin, it would only really pay attention to the first row. So anytime you're making updates, like multiple updates to a SQL database using a repeating table, we generally have to create PowerShell scripts to accomplish that. So the Oledb query is going to be inputting the total price that I say here. Since it's just one field, not a repeating table. And then you should see the total price formatted field get populated by the set column plugin once we extract the $sign out of this and make it, just a floating point value. And just to verify, this is our folder that we've created to house the attachments. So you should see this get populated as well once we send this through the workflow. So if we take a look at the workflow, the set column plugin should have ran, and then setting the form field equal to that plugin. The copy attachments should have ran, so we should see that on the server in just a second. And the run PowerShell script should be currently running. So if you look at the configurations on these plugins, you'll see here that the copy attachments and the set column are a bit different from the run PowerShell script. Now, this might look a bit different in different versions of Composer, but in the version that we're in right now, there is an option for continue without waiting. So we set it to false, usually on every plugin, because if it were set to true, this approval node would have already been assigned, even though this PowerShell script might not have ran yet. So what this does basically is make sure that the workflow stops and runs this PowerShell script before continuing on to assign the approval. So, it's just basically based on how you need the workflow to function, but we set up workflows, to be sequential. So we want to make sure that this runs before this is ever assigned. So if I look down here, you should see the task name. It's currently running the PowerShell. And you know what? I don't think that I actually attached a document. So while it's running that PowerShell, I'm going to cook up one more of these and attach a file this time. And you should see that on the server. Actually going to wait to submit that one so that we can see the changes to SQL, because I don't want these changes to overwrite it. So that is another timing issue that I could bring up is, if the workflow that we currently have in process is making changes to SQL and that PowerShell script hasn't run yet, and then somebody opens up the form and tries to make changes, obviously these fields won't have been changed if the PowerShell script hasn't run yet. So, it's obviously just a timing of, 1 or 2 minutes, but if two people try to make changes to the same thing within minutes of each other, whoever made the change last is going to be the winner. So, sometimes, we have to make sure that we set up security to make sure that doesn't happen. So it looks like our approval is assigned for that task. So if we go back to SQL, here we can see that line here has been updated, Kent WEBtips update, and we've added a line. So that was what our PowerShell script accomplished. And if we go to our other database, which is being populated by the Oledb query, our request ID is 17. It's not there yet because we need to open up this approval and approve that one to run the rest of the plugins. But first, I will save and route this one so we can see the attachment at work. Okay, so we just had to wait a little bit, but it is in there, so you can see the document that we attached there was added here. So you can really attach anything that you can attach in the form. So a PDF document, a TXT document, anything that you can attach to the attachment control in the form, you can copy to a drive or a network drive, as long as it is accessible by the SharePoint web front end that you have your SharePoint site installed on. So as long as this server has access to the network drive, you can attach the file there. So I'm going to go into my tasks, find 17, and you can see the formatted price here. So we stripped out the $sign with that set column plugin and set it to the form field. So we will approve this. And you'll see I'm getting emails for these assignments. Okay. Now, in the process list, we can see that our request is sitting at the wait 5 minutes plugin. So this is another plugin like the Run PowerShell that has a continue without waiting parameter as well. So we set that to false so that the workflow does not continue past here until the server has processed this for 5 minutes. So the update price table, which is our Oledb plugin, should have ran, and we should have set the item permissions for that SharePoint item. So if we go to the SQL server, there we go. We see our total price from the form, and we see the request ID. So this is just a simple example of adding lines to a SQL database from the workflow. You can go as crazy as you need to with it. Any SQL query that really works in here should work just fine in the workflow. Any amount of columns you need. This was just a simple example to set it up and show you what you can do with it. So I'll check and make sure if there's any questions, we answer them while we're waiting here. I don't see any questions, so hopefully my expert explanation of these was sufficient. I'll keep monitoring the questions though if anything comes in. And just a note about the wait 5 minutes plugin. So it waits 5 minutes based on when it gets to this plugin on the server and what the server time is. So we've had people ask, say you set the plugin to wait 1 day. It might be a little fuzzy as to when that day starts. So you might think, if I process an item at 1:00 p.m. on a Wednesday, are we saying, wait 1 business day? So, in the morning on the next day, is the task going to be available? That's not necessarily the case. So it'll wait, if this was set to 1 day instead of 5 minutes, it'll wait exactly 1 day, 24 hours from the time that that node was hit. So if we hit this node at 1:00 on a Wednesday, the following Thursday at 1:00, that task will be available, or it'll move on to whatever's next in the workflow at that time. And actually, while we're waiting, I promised to show an example of how we would set up a Winshuttle update plugin. So I did not create a transaction script as a test for this, but we don't necessarily need that to show off the functionality. So we would select Winshuttle update from the drop-down if we're running a transaction script. And in our parameters here, as soon as we import the web service into the solution, so if it's a transaction script, we would import there. If it's a query script, we would import here. As soon as that is imported into the solution, we can choose that from the drop-down in web service here. And that's really the only thing that you have to configure. I've never had to configure these other parameters there. So then, wherever this is in the workflow, it'll run that. And then generally, we will put a decision node. Let me just put a dummy log field here. So here's where we would put an approval node. And an OR join. So if either of these paths hit this OR, we can continue along the workflow. So this is where we would capture the error. In the transition line here, there should be a function match. So we want to match based on ERR. So, you know, this is a very common way of showing what an error could be in a log field. Let me make sure I'm getting that right. So I believe it is the sequence that you want to match first, and then it is the field value second. So you would, you know, tell it which field you're looking at for the match statement, and then tell it what you're looking to match. Now, you might have to know a little bit more of the intricacies of what an error looks like for your particular T code, you know, because sometimes it'll say no changes made or something of that sort rather than just error. But generally, if you put in ERR with a colon, that'll capture the vast majority of your transaction script errors. So, you know, if we ran the script and there's an error in the log field, we're going to assign this to be handled by somebody. Otherwise, we will continue down the workflow. So that's a pretty simple setup. Okay, so now you see we don't see that in the process list anymore. So the wait plugin has finished its 5 minutes of waiting. And if we go to the list here, we're not going to see item 17 anymore because the plugin at the end of the workflow here has deleted the item. So that is about all I have for the plugins. As I said before, that is, you know, just a few of the plugins, 8 out of the, I don't know the exact number of how many there are, but if I just go into the drop down here, there's quite a few. Those are just some of the very common ones that I see used frequently. All right, and I'm looking at the questions box again, and I don't see any questions. So I'm going to go through my little spiel to end the web tips, and I will still look at the questions box in case anybody has one. But I thank you all for attending the session this week. As always, we go through coming up sessions. So we have a Winshuttle user group coming up in Columbus. That's, you know, Winshuttle's user group, June the 12th of this year at Wolf's Ridge Brewing. And Thursday, June 20th, will be the next Winshuttle WEBtips. And that is regarding recording long text with Studio. And as always, you can go to our website, www.clearprocesssolutions.com, to see any other user group meetings or any other events that aren't listed here, as well as future WEBtips sessions and what their topics are. And shown here, we do have an option for solution care provided by Clear Process Solutions, which covers quite a bit of ground. You know, almost anything you could really think of for support on your Winshuttle solutions, any click dashboarding support you may need. All of that is listed in, you know, what is covered here in the solution care column. You know, so we'll help you roadmap any solutions you have, or, you know, troubleshoot any issues you're having with your solutions, you know, give you guidance, anything you can really think of. And that is it for this week. Thank you all for joining, and have a great day.